program with our third panel. All right. Yeah. Who needs it? And by the way, this panel is a special treat because they're all in person. They're all here, which is a first, right, for us. Before I introduce our moderator for this panel, I did want to point out, I mentioned earlier to you the Great Lakes Economic Forum in Chicago. They're actually, if you're interested in attending, be sure to use the Cousle, CUSLE passcode, because you get a 15% discount off your registration as a part of Cousle. So please do that. So our panel today, right now, our third panel is Building the Future of Energy Supply Chains in North America. And it's an honor to have as our moderator, Martha Hall Finley. Martha Hall Finley is the Chief Climate Officer of Suncor Energy, and importantly, is a member of the Executive Committee of the Canada-United States Law Institute. She is also twice elected member of Canadian Parliament, where she served in the official opposition shadow cabinet for international trade, finance, transport, infrastructure, and communities. And she is currently a member of the Minister of International Trade's Trade Expert Advisory Council. As Suncor's Chief Climate Officer, she leads Suncor's efforts to address the nexus of climate change and energy, and to build an environment that supports a future for Canadian energy. This includes, by the way, leading the multi-company oil sands pathways to net zero by 2050 initiative. She was named a Canadian Climate Champion in 2021 by the British High Commission and the Canada Climate Law Initiative. And she was also named by the Energy Council as a top global female oil and gas executive. She has worked in public policy think tanks, written dozens of essays, articles, and op-eds for national publications, and has over 30 years of experience as a corporate lawyer, international trade expert, senior executive, and successful entrepreneur. So, Martha, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I'm about to introduce my panelists by saying the bios are in the materials, so I'm not actually going to do the whole bio, so I'm feeling a little embarrassed. But thank you so much, Stephen. And isn't it great that we're all back here together, mostly in person? So thank you again for you and the team in pulling all of this together. And before I forget, if you haven't had a chance, the butterfly exhibit is extraordinary. So even if you have a chance to deke out for a half an hour, I was assured when I came in this morning that it is in fact open. Great venue to be able to do this. This panel is to talk about building the future of energy supply chains in North America. And really, you know, when we talked about what we were going to discuss at this panel, there are two aspects of that. There are lots of aspects of that. Actually, can I do this? Okay, no idea. Which one do I push? There, okay. So there are two aspects to the concept of energy supply chains in North America. One is the supply chains that are needed for the production of energy. So we will have some conversation about, you know, what are the elements required to produce electricity? What are some of the supplies that are needed to build transmission lines, for example, pipes, because of course there are many sources of energy, natural gas, oil, electricity, which is produced from a variety of other sources, uranium, coal, natural gas, etc. But there's another aspect that I think recent events have really highlighted, and which I hope we'll have a good chance to discuss today. And that is the energy, the supply of energy itself. And that has become even more important given what's happened with Russia and Ukraine, because there's a greater sense, yes, we have supply from Canada to the United States. Those of us old enough to remember the original free trade agreement, there's language in there where the Canada had leverage because we're such a big energy source of oil and gas. And at that time, the United States wasn't so much. And it was very important to the United States to have that security. So there's language in the original one, the original FTA, to prevent Canada from doing anything. I'm paraphrasing, don't do anything stupid that'll hurt our supply. Fast forward to, I think you heard my friend Goldie last night talking about the President Biden going to talk to Maduro and Venezuela and some of the others. And we're here in Canada going, we have a lot of that stuff, and maybe we should speak more openly and more deeply. But there's also the opportunity, I think, for North America to work collectively in terms of the security of global energy supply. So how can Canada and the United States and Mexico work collectively as like-minded countries to ensure and to help ensure global energy security for others around the world? And so there are two aspects of that discussion that I am looking forward to doing today. The map that I did have, there we go. This is a map. It was done by CSIS at the request of the Canadian Embassy in the United States. You're not going to be able to read any of that. The whole point of this map is to show you just how extraordinarily complex energy infrastructure is in North America. It's really complicated. In Canada, we can't even get pipelines from our oil supplies in the West into Eastern Canada. The refineries off the East Coast actually don't take Canadian, they take some by boat, ironically, but they actually take an awful lot of oil from other parts of the world. Again, global changes, geopolitical changes are forcing some changes in some of those discussions. But enough to say, it's not an easy answer, it's very complicated. So that's the only reason I put that up. I'm not actually talking about numbers, it was really just to show the complexity. The panelists that we have, and I am not doing their full bios because they are in your materials. Heather Ferguson is going to go first. Heather is the Senior Vice President, Business Development and Strategy and Corporate Affairs for Ontario Power Generation. Pete Sheffield will go next. He's the Vice President for External Affairs and the Chief Sustainability Officer for Enbridge. Third will be Gary Sutherland, Director of Strategic Affairs and Stakeholder Relations at Hydro-Quebec. And filling in with some of the more supply chain to be able to produce supply energy is JB Chronister, Senior Director of Business Development at Cleveland Cliffs Inc. and Chairman of the American Iron and Steel Institute Automotive Applications Council. So our panel, we will start with Heather.
Thanks. I hope everybody can hear me okay. So just to further, I think, Martha's point there. So this map back here, I actually took it back to my team about a week ago and said, can you just try to produce something a little bit more simple on this? And I just don't think there's any way anyone's gonna be able to understand that. And they actually took 3 stabs at it. And every time they came back with something that was pretty much just as complicated. So I really do think, to Martha's point, either my team just doesn't get it or it really is complicated. So I'll tell you just a little bit about Ontario Power Generation, or OPG is the acronym. So we're the largest generator in the province of Ontario, produce about half the power. We're not the transmitter or the local distribution company, but we just generate. Our portfolio is pretty diverse. We're actually one of the most diverse generators in North America, but predominantly nuclear, hydro, and then we've also got our gas facilities. We've got some solar, we've got some biomass, and a whole host of other things, but predominantly nuclear and predominantly hydro. But we also have some US assets, hydro assets under the subsidiary Eagle Creek Renewable Energy, ECRE, if you've seen that around. So we have a long history in the province of Ontario, and whenever I'm out, I'm always reminded by my team to sort of mention, we closed all of our coal facilities, culminated in a decade worth of effort. We took 9,000 megawatts of coal out of the Ontario system in 2014. And really what enabled that was in large part our base load generation in our nuclear facilities and in our hydro facilities. And so 2014, we burned our last piece of coal. And what we've really been doing since then is going through what many other utilities are doing, is going through a clean energy transition. I mean, we came from a very clean place once we closed the coal, but we continue to look at things to improve our portfolio. And we've made our own climate change commitment to be net zero by 2040. And we're on a pathway to do that. A handful of the things that we're looking at are around many of the things we've spoken about today, but electrification of transportation, electrification of the economy, hydrogen, small modular reactors. I'm going to spend a moment or two talking about that in a second. So a whole host of things. But today, I think this panel is going to be focusing on, what's happening in the world of energy, a lot. And I'm going to try to focus on a couple things that are quite relevant to Canada-US relations, just a couple things. And I'm not going to talk about the geopolitical forces because there's people here way more knowledgeable and educated to have probably covered that and can cover it than me. But it is a huge, huge influence, obviously, on what's going on in the world of energy in terms of gas prices and in terms of availability of things in the supply chain. I'm not going to talk about economic recovery post-COVID, but I would just mention, and I think everyone can appreciate what a huge enabler the energy system is to economic recovery. Just in jobs, GDP, supply chain at the local level, at the regional level, at a cross-border level. So a huge one, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about climate change and the drive to net zero. And net zero means different things for different jurisdictions. Federally, we have a drive to net zero by 2050 in Canada. At OPG, we have a drive to net zero by 2040. But perhaps most critically and concerning is the drive of our federal government to get its electricity system to net zero by 2035, which is an incredibly aggressive target. So there's a couple opportunities that I'll talk about that are relevant to our relationship with the US and opportunities, really important opportunities for collaboration, but there's a huge amount of risk wrapped up in that. And I think probably everyone can appreciate in a world where you're trying to electrify everything because of climate change, if you drive your electricity system to net zero too quickly, the cost will be exorbitant and the reliability will not be there, which will in turn deter and slow down your ability to electrify, because if your grid's not reliable, people aren't going to buy EVs and fleets are not going to electrify and the whole system won't hang together. So that's sort of the context of the risks, but the opportunities. And this is the Canada-US piece, and a bit through an Ontario lens or an OPG lens. And the two pieces I wanted to mention was one around critical minerals. And I know there's been a lot of really good conversations already today about critical minerals, but I'll take a bit of a different angle. And then the second one is going to be small modular reactors. And everyone in the room, if you've ever heard of a small modular reactor or know what it is, put your hand up. Okay, so good. I've got my, I'll spend some time explaining what the heck those are. So on the critical minerals piece, again, I think there's a couple angles. There's the obvious one, and I think, you've spoken about it already today. Canada has vast resources in the critical minerals area that have not been explored, and there's tremendous potential. And they're incredibly important for EV batteries, for solar panels, for windmills, for a huge ton of clean technologies that will be important as we think about climate change and electrifying. And the US is not sitting in as good of a position there, but we're very fortunate to be close partners, allies, and there's a tremendous potential there for us to supply the US with those resources, so they're not at a disadvantage. But then I also think a little bit more beyond that. And this is maybe a bit of a more of a unique Ontario thing. So if we think about Ontario and the vast critical mineral resources we have actually in Ontario, there's a small area in Northern Ontario called the Ring of Fire. Many of you probably heard the Johnny Cash song, Ring of Fire, same idea. So it's a very wealthy region in terms of those untapped resources. And I actually asked someone today, I said, okay, come on, like, how can I explain how bountiful this is or how rich this is or what could this mean? And no one could really come back and tell me, how vast the resources are, of course, because they haven't been explored fully yet. There's only estimates of what this could mean, but the estimates are billions and billions of dollars in GDP, billions and billions of dollars in terms of mining. And we're talking about things like chromite and all the critical resources that you would think of needing as we look to electrify the economy. So it's a huge untapped resource. And I think it would be very beneficial to Canada and to the US to explore this. But also surrounding that area in the Ring of Fire, which is, to give you a sense, about 500 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. So pretty far up there. There's no roads, there's no transmission, there's no access. Some roads are being built, some early days roads, but it's largely in a very, very access challenged part of Ontario. But there's tremendous potential there, and there's Indigenous communities that surround this Ring of Fire. They're called the Matawa Communities. They're in that area, and I think there's been a couple times where companies have tried to get this off the ground. I know Cliff had made an earlier attempt to kind of get this going because it's such an incredibly important area for exploration, but they weren't able to. So we are working with those communities. The province is working with those communities, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity given the immense importance here and now to liberate those critical minerals, but also to connect the north and the south in Ontario. So a chance where you can actually enable these critical minerals out of a part of the Ontario that would benefit the Indigenous communities and connect it to the auto manufacturing, the EV auto manufacturing, the battery manufacturing, all that is going to go on in the south as well, and creating an economy around that connects the north and the south. So kind of wrapping up critical minerals before I go on to SMRs is sort of it's this US, Canada, tremendous potential, but also within Ontario, the tremendous potential between north and south and Indigenous communities, which is going to become a pretty important focus area, I think. And then SMRs. So again, Ontario is kind of unique. And I always remind myself when I look at maps of the makeup of generation across the US and across Canada, we're pretty unique. We get 60% of our generation from nuclear. It's only 30% of the installed capacity, but the energy that comes out provides us with 60% of our generation. And it's what enabled us to get off of coal. And we're taking another look at sort of the next iteration of nuclear generation technology in Ontario. And that's in the form of small modular reactors, so SMRs. These are roughly 300 megawatts. So, sort of a quarter or a fifth of the size of your standard large nuclear plant, much smaller. And as the name would imply, they're produced modularly. They're fabricated off-site, and then they kind of are brought in. You construct around that. They're simpler to operate. They're cheaper to run, and they're modular. You can add on to them as your load goes up. So we're looking at that, and we're going to be siting one, hopefully, at our Darlington facility in 2028. We already have an EA in place, and we also have a site preparation license from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So we're in a good place, but there's still lots of work to be done. But again, getting back to the collaboration piece. So we are collaborating with the US on that. So we are working closely. We've chosen a technology partner, GH Hitachi, and we are working very closely with Tennessee Valley Authority. And I think there was just an announcement that came out the other day. So TVA, the largest public utility in the US, as I understand it. We are working alongside them with a view that we will go first and they will follow very quickly with their deployment of SMRs at Clinch River, I believe. So another very, very important piece of collaboration between Canada and the US. And then also the second side of that, which is equally important, is we are collaborating across Canada with multiple provinces on the deployment of SMRs. So we're collaborating with Saskatchewan, Alberta, and New Brunswick. And I think the importance around the collaboration here is to sort of take those first of a kind risks and costs and spread them across multiple users to help improve the economic and the economies of scales for these SMRs. And they really are seen as going to be critical, I think, for jurisdictions that want to get off fossil fuel, that maybe don't have plentiful hydro resources and other technologies that can support that. So those are two key pieces of work that we're very focused on. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks, Heather. Over to you.
Thank you, Martha. Thanks, Heather. I, for one, was really pleased that Martha didn't read our bios, because after hearing hers, I felt very insecure.
I'm way older than you
no,
are, okay? Just saying.
I don't think that's true. So first off, it's a privilege to be invited to speak here and on this important, very timely topic, a series of topics that have been covered throughout the day. It's also a couple of sort of broad observations, and then I'll hit a few points and disclaimer. I wrote some notes on the plane so I wouldn't forget. So, but I did think when I was reflecting on my way in that it's fitting that we're having a conversation about energy and the importance of energy in Cleveland, which is a city rich in its energy traditions and certainly appreciates the transformative power of energy and the importance of investing in all elements of the energy value chain. There are probably many folks in the room that can speak to that with greater command than me. Also, thought it was even more relevant that we were here at Case Western Reserve, which has a rich history as well, and is almost 200 years old as an institution and had at its founding a focus that was quite unique at the time and remains extremely important in terms of a focus on innovation and applied sciences, which also very much extend to the conversation around energy and energy transition that Heather spoke to. It's also fitting that today is Earth Day. It's the 52nd annual celebration of the planet, and that this year's theme is Invest in the Planet. And so I thought I would acknowledge that. So we are in a moment that Martha rightly underscored, where the importance of energy security, the importance of global energy markets, what that means, what we've been reminded of in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the energy supply crunch that Europe is facing, and the opportunities that extend, lessons that we can learn from a North American perspective, but also opportunities to support our global allies. That's extremely important, and so is addressing climate change. And that's maybe the first point that I'd like to make, and I think the theme will keep coming back, but is this notion that, and Goldie, for those who were at dinner last night, hit on some of these themes. We didn't compare notes, I promise, but maybe we have a similar worldview. Too often, and really all public discussion, they're choices that are simply yes or no, that are this or that, all or nothing, and certainly it feels like that in the context of energy and in the environment these days. But I think what we need to do from a U.S. and Canadian perspective, when we think about what's happening in a global context, but also on our shores, is really think about energy security and energy transition is not a binary choice. But Tim used this in an earlier panel, but this sort of yes and proposition. And to be clear, at Enbridge, we fully believe and are actively participating in the transition that Heather described, and that our organizations and that the US and Canada are fixated on, that has as its sort of true north an ambition to align to the goals of the Paris Agreement and get to net zero. We may have different timescales on how we get there, different pathways to achieve it, but we're very much focused on that. And we think that the pace of that transition needs to be and will be driven by technology and innovation, as I referenced earlier, and policy. And hopefully, and I'd observe as well that policy is typically very much a lagging indicator to public sentiment, but hopefully, and we've lacked this in terms of energy policy and climate policy as well from a certainly from a US perspective, but I think in a North American global context as well, sort of a durable, long-term orientation to this transition and how to do it in a way. Certainly this is important for policymakers, but important for operators throughout the value chain as well, to ensure that we're focused on all three elements of the three-legged stool in an energy systems context, which is energy security. So it's reliability, not just of supply, but access to that supply in an affordable manner, while focusing on an ever cleaner energy source. And I think we all represent or have connections to energy sources that fit two of the three, but it's hard to find because there are really no perfect energy solutions, I would observe, that have all three at scale today. But that's what I think everybody on this panel is focused on. Another observation, because I think it speaks to energy in a global context and sort of the developed world versus the developing world, is that access to energy is not today universal. And I think we have the luxury in the US and Canada of not necessarily giving that short shrift, but not necessarily absorbing what that means when you think about the fact that there are 2.6 billion people on the planet that don't have reliable access or even predictable access to electricity or to natural gas for cooking or other sort of rights that we take for granted, much less in an affordable or reliable capacity. And, you know, another observation, sort of pulling the lens back and looking at this from a global perspective, you know, of the non-OECD nations, I think roughly half of those nations still rely on coal or traditional biomass. I'll leave it to you to fill in the blanks there. That's what they count on for their primary source of energy, and not just for power generation, but for all different sources. So there's tremendous opportunity when you pull the lens back and think about energy in a global context and the abundance of resources that are available in a US and Canadian context. I had a few more data points, but I'm starting to bore myself on that. So I'll keep moving. And maybe back to where I started, right? So society is going to need more energy, and we have to address the climate. And, you know, I observed, and maybe do you have?
Yes.
Yeah. So, oh, didn't realize I was supposed to do it myself. So, to meet the dual challenge, there we are. We're going to have to drive emissions reductions from conventional sources of energy, which, as we were reminded in Martha's bio, is very much what she and other producers are focused on in terms of the Transition Pathways Initiative. And I'll speak to that in brief from an Enbridge perspective. So we're going to have to find ways to use conventional energy in a way that's far less impactful from an environmental and climate perspective. And there's a lot of energy and focus and resources behind that. And we're also going to have to ramp up investments in renewables and low carbon solutions and things like small modular reactors that Heather spoke to. So it's yes, and Canada and the US are well positioned to do both. And the map behind me, I'm not going to go through in excruciating detail, but I thought it might be useful because it represents our portfolio of businesses from an Enbridge perspective. And it gives you a sense of how we think and what our reference point is when you think about energy, and also it gives a little bit of visibility to our direction of travel in terms of the energy transition. As you might imagine, by all of the infrastructure that hugs the Canadian-US border, we think an awful lot about North American energy supply chains and how that's changing. So I'm going to give a quick flyover. certain of these assets garner more attention than others. It was gratifying to hear a question about our Line 5 pipeline. And I hope you were satisfied with the answer that you received. But, Line 5, for example, represents an element of a much larger system that we operate, but it's indicative of sort of this critical infrastructure that we operate. It moves 540,000 barrels a day. That's roughly 23 million gallons of light crude and natural gas liquids on a daily basis. And it moves product. Typically that product is coming from Canada. We're picking it up in Superior, Wisconsin. We're moving it through Wisconsin and Michigan to Sarnia, Ontario. It's coming back to the US in the form of gasoline, jet fuel, propane, and it's supporting millions of consumers, thousands of businesses, and critical elements of the economy throughout the Great Lakes region. That's one pipeline. Just from a crude oil perspective, we move about 2/3 of Canadian crude oil exports. Virtually all of that is moving to the United States today. And an awful lot of it is, it's all to support Midwest refineries, save that, which makes it its way into Canada and back, as I described earlier. And interestingly, about, try to do the math, probably 60%, 50% of that 2/3 is single source. So Midwest refineries have no other alternative than to rely on heavy crude or medium crudes or light crudes that are coming off of our system as a conduit to Canadian production. So just a bit of a reference point. Beyond our crude oil business, which gets a lot of attention, we've been transforming our business for the last couple of decades. So we're the largest gas utility in Canada, in Ontario, and in Quebec. We move through our natural gas transmission and storage business in the US and Canada, about 20% of the gas that's consumed on a daily basis. And we touch about 170 million customers in the US. And we have a renewable power business that over the last 20 years, we've grown organically and continue to invest in that business. We've got wind and solar assets onshore in the United States and Canada, and we've invested heavily over the last 5 to 10 years in offshore wind in Europe and continue to invest in those opportunities. And I think importantly, and in the context of the dual challenge of energy security and energy transition, each of these businesses, and I think maybe you can see it, but each of those businesses are actively pursuing low carbon opportunities. And those may be opportunities to reduce our own operational emissions. We have a net zero commitment. It's a bit of my remit to ensure that we're building the architecture internally to ensure that we can deliver on those goals, the emissions targets that we've set, the diversity and inclusion commitments that we've made, and what that means in terms of how we engage with our future workforce, but also our host communities and Indigenous people. But in the context of emissions and emissions reduction, we're leveraging our know-how from a renewables perspective and beginning to integrate that in how we operate those more conventional infrastructures. And so we're powering our pump stations and compressor stations with renewable power that we're developing that has the added benefit of actually controlling one of our more variable costs, certainly on the liquids business, which is the power it takes to drive or energize those pump stations to move Martha's and other producers' products to market. We're also extremely focused on how to help our customers reduce their emissions and focus on the larger societal objectives of moving to low carbon solutions in a way that actually leverages that existing network that we own and operate, because we see our pipelines and related infrastructure being used and useful through the transition. And so some examples of that in our Canadian gas utility, we were actually the first in North America to develop jointly with a company that's now part of Cummins, a green hydrogen power to gas facility. So an electrolyzer that, as a result, we're pulling hydrogen and blending that into our utility. In Ontario, we have a pilot in Quebec as well, where we may blend up to 15% hydrogen, which has a significant benefit in terms of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that delivered natural gas, but also gives us some early learnings into the potential for us to use that existing infrastructure to scale up hydrogen over time. More immediate and equally sort of beneficial from a GHG perspective, at least in the context of blue hydrogen, we're pursuing renewable natural gas in a big way, and have actually for the last decade at our utility, and increasingly looking upstream. So our gas transmission business is partnering with renewable natural gas developers and companies like Starbucks and other public companies that may have different motivations, but are looking for opportunities to take their waste and offset it with a renewable solution. And we'll continue to scale that up over time. And then the big opportunity is around carbon capture and utilization and storage, or carbon capture sequestration. Depends on which acronym you want to rely on. But back to reducing the emissions associated with conventional fuels, and where the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has landed, where the International Energy Agency and their net zero modeling have landed, is we can't get there from here without carbon capture. There are any number of other options that need to be sufficiently explored, not the least of which is, back to the developed world, huge potential just from efficiency and the wasteful nature and how we use energy, consume energy from an OECD perspective. But carbon capture is a huge opportunity, and we're pursuing that. We recently announced a partnership with Capital Power, an Alberta power company and a cement company in Alberta. And our other partner is a collaborative of First Nations who are also going to support the project from an equity standpoint. And this has the potential. We've gotten early support from the government of Alberta, got a very positive signal out of the government of Canada in the form of some incentives that were contained in their budget that provide a price signal analogous to what exists in the US today. It's a 45Q tax credit that drives investment for those carbon sources, at least the ones that we're partnering with today, and could sequester up to 4 million tons a year of carbon emissions. And if you can scale that up, and there's a lot of focus in Alberta, certainly a lot of focus from major integrated companies throughout the world to figure out how to scale up this technology and how to leverage it, not just at production, but there's a scenario where we could use carbon capture to reduce the emissions associated with our gas-fired compressor stations that move gas through our system. So I could go on. I guess maybe a couple of, this was actually the stuff that I wrote down. So five things. They are just headlines, but how do we, from a US Canadian perspective, capture the opportunity to marry energy security and energy transition, to bring that to bear from a North American perspective, but also to meet the moment, if you will, in terms of providing support to our global allies and reducing global emissions in the process. So first off, this won't come as a surprise. We need to do everything we can to support the existing energy supply chain by maintaining critical infrastructure. It's incumbent on us as an operator to make sure that we're maintaining that infrastructure, that we're modernizing it, that it's operating more efficiently, that if there are ways to further reduce safety or environmental risk, that we're bringing those to bear. But line 5 is critical infrastructure. And the implications of an economic scenario without line 5 in the near to midterm are catastrophic. And there are many more examples. We have an abundance of supply in this country, and we still have a policy that's very much focused on the idea of scarcity in some respects, and certainly when we think about it outside of our shores. From a natural gas perspective, there's a huge opportunity in the US and in Canada to build the infrastructure, to permit takeaway capacity to move more volume of liquefied natural gas to Europe, to Asia. I referenced the amount of coal that's being used in the rest of the world to generate electricity. That alone is worth pursuing that in a bigger way. But you think about Europe and the situation that they're in, it's that much more prevalent. I said 5. Martha's giving me the hook, so I'm just going to offer 2 more. One is just the observation, and I think the previous panel spoke to this in terms of what was described as sort of an ethical value chain. From a North American perspective, we think about that as in the context of environmental social governance, ESG, and from a full ESG perspective, energy production in Canada and the US is rivaled maybe by Australia, but nowhere else in the world are barrels produced or is energy produced in a way that has emissions and social impact and human rights considerations as we do in North America. And we should continue down that path and leverage it in a global context. And the last part, which I think many of my remarks have focused on, but we have to continue to reduce emissions at a pace that the science suggests is required while we supply. And it's a tremendous opportunity that's staring us right in the face from a North American perspective, and hopeful that Canada and the United States will make the most of it.
Thanks, Pete. I would add Norway.
Yes.
As an oil producer that is unashamed of being an oil producer, and in fact right now has increased production because they're very publicly saying, why on earth would we cede market share to OPEC plus? I do think there are lessons that we can learn in other parts of the world for sure. And I just want to say, just when Pete described, we both had maps, right, to show how complicated it is. And Pete mentioned all of the oil, for example, oil and gas that goes down into the United States, but in particular the oil, because Suncor is a big oil company, a lot of that oil goes down to the States. But what an awful lot of people don't realize is that it goes down to the States. So our heavy goes down into the Gulf Coast refineries. It then goes all around the world. So my point on reinforcing that is that this is a North American activity that services the rest of the world. So it isn't just Canadian oil serving the United States. It is a North American opportunity. We're already living it. The opportunities, I think, are even greater. Okay, over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Martha. Thanks. So I'm going to take you to a little bit of a different context. I work for Hydro-Quebec, so the leading utility in the province of Quebec. And I think my remarks are probably going to touch on some of the main themes that both Heather and Pete touched on. So definitely the energy transition, definitely questions of energy security, but maybe much more affordability as well for our clients. So not to be undone, I've got my complicated map as well. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but sometimes I do like to talk a little bit about what Quebec looks like in terms of energy. So we're primarily a hydropower generating province. We have 61 generating stations that are located right across the province, and 177 terawatt hours. This is what energy geeks love to talk about, is BTUs or terawatt hours or something. To give you an idea, I was surprised actually to find out that Ohio in an entire year will use 142, 143 terawatt hours. New York State is about 156. We theoretically have enough energy stored in our reservoirs to handle all of their electricity needs, either one of those states, but not both, for an entire year. So we have a very big reservoir system. Of course, we have a small population, but a small population that lives in a northern climate with heating needs that are a little bit different from maybe what you would see in the continental US. And about 80% of our residential customers do actually use electricity for heating. In addition to that, we've got a whole lot of other capacity on our system. So a lot of wind, about 4,000 megawatts these days, and calls for tenders in the last 2-3 months have pretty much totaled about 3,000 megawatts for the coming years. Biomass, biogas, and we've been looking at solar a little bit. And I'll explain why later. It's not because we have that much sun shining on Quebec. We're not California, definitely not these days. It snowed Tuesday morning, but there is a reason that we're looking a lot at solar. The third aspect that I'd like to look at is this figure, 99.6% clean energy on our grid. So we're blessed by a fabulous geography. This was not based on decisions in the past that we're looking at clean energy, that we're looking at decarbonization and deciding that that was the way that the world had to go. It's just because we have a lot of water. 22% of our territory is covered in water. It was the natural go-to when we were looking at what we should be building throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s. Of course, fast forward to today, it's a fabulous resource that we can build on. We can add different types of other types of renewable energy to it and come to something which is really quite amazing, and almost carbon-free grid. The point for people ask me about this a lot, it's mainly imports of energy that we bring in from New York. Now, this is all brought together and makes us pretty much the largest renewable energy generator in all of North America. We have a very vast transmission grid as well, which brings all of that energy from up north down into our population centers, down in the southern part of Quebec and beyond, because we spend a lot of time looking at our electricity markets. And this is what I'd like to get into a little bit. We have a very, very good handle on the generation portion of all this. The transmission portion is a different thing. The green line that you see behind me is the last line that we were able to build into our Northeast markets in the US. It was over 30 years ago. So we've been working on a transmission grid and increasing gradually our footprint in terms of exports, but we haven't managed to build a new line in all that time. Just to give you an idea of where we sell, so we send energy into Ontario. We send probably about half of what we sell year in, year out into New England. In New England these days, we represent about 17% of the entire electricity supply of the region. New York is about 25% of our energy that we send there. We're 5% of New York's energy supply these days. And then a little bit into Atlantic Canada and a little bit into markets that are a little further south. So decarbonization has been a pillar of our corporate strategy now for a very long time, both in Quebec, where we work on a lot of the same things that Heather was discussing. Electrifying the transport grid, bringing charging stations right across the province so that people can feel confident about buying electric vehicles and being able to circulate on the territory and have access to those charging stations. Looking at other types of transport, heavier transport that may be using hydrogen or other industrial uses that may be using hydrogen. We do a lot of work on both hydrogen and battery storage as well. That's an important part of some of our research work these days. Solar, I mentioned a few minutes ago. Solar is, of course, one of those sources of energy that is really implanting itself throughout the markets that are around us. And our hydropower has a very important characteristic. It's that we're able to balance the intermittency of other energy sources like solar or like wind. We have a lot of wind on our system. We balance it ourselves with our hydropower. So when the wind is flowing, we turn our hydro off. When wind slows down, we turn our hydro back on. That's the beauty of a reservoir system, is that you have that flexibility to be able to follow what other sources of energy are producing on your system and what your load is looking like at any given time. And our biggest stations can ramp up and ramp down from pretty much 0 to their full capacity in about 5 to 6 minutes. So it's a very, very high performing system. And we wanted to be able to do the same thing with solar energy. The pattern of solar energy is not quite the same as wind. So we do have to kind of try it out in-house. So we brought on pretty close to 10 megawatts of solar capacity in southern Quebec to be able to look at that. Now, of course, we do want to, in addition to be working on the Quebec market and working on all of these issues that are at our door today, look a little bit towards the future. And we see ourselves as basically being the motor of decarbonization in Quebec. As we move through a decarbonization scenario, of course, there's many fuel switches that are going to be made. So those remaining customers using heating oil or natural gas to heat their residences will probably be moving more towards electricity. And so recently we've released our strategic plan, and it calls for actually a huge increase in the resources that we have available to us, because if we are going to get to carbon neutrality by 2050, we estimate that we'll probably need to bring on 100 terawatt hours more of generating capacity. We currently generate year in, year out about 210. So it's an incredible revolution, I would say, in the way that we do things. This is basically bringing on 50% extra from a generation perspective. Where is it going to come from? Well, there's a lot that we can do in our existing facilities through refurbishment to increase generation. The wind energy that I was speaking about before is another big aspect of this. And we're looking at this globally, not only in terms of what's going on in Quebec, but what is happening in our markets. Because of course, it's great for us to reduce our emissions at home, but if we can reduce them somewhere else, that is just as good for the planet. It's a planetary problem, so there should be a planetary solution to that. So we've also started to look at some new transmission projects. And there are a couple here, so I'm going to speak very quickly about the two of them. This is a transmission line that goes from Quebec into Maine. In 2018, Massachusetts concluded a clean energy RFP, so a request for proposals. Hydro-Quebec was chosen as the supplier for that RFP. But to be able to fulfill that contract, we had to build new transmission into New England. So our transmission these days, when demand is high in New England, is completely saturated. It's like the highway where the cars are no longer really moving. So we need a second highway if we're going to be able to increase substantially those exports. This line would carry close to 10 terawatt hours. Massachusetts in total uses 55, so it's a considerable portion of their future electricity supply. This project was completely permitted both at the level of the Maine state authorities and the federal authorities in Washington. But last fall, through a citizens referendum, ran up against some very big difficulties. The citizens referendum basically voted the project down and said to legislators, we want you to revoke the permits for this project and to put it to a halt. It was already under construction in Maine, so construction activities have been stopped. And right now the project is at a standstill and is before the courts. So we'll be seeing probably between now and the fall what the outcome of this project would be.
It's Maine that has canceled the project, but the power is
Is
destined
for Massachusetts.
Right.
Yes. Small level of complexity for everybody. There's two states involved, which of course doesn't help. But it's the reality really of that region is that the demand for electricity is in the south of New England, and we have to work with the states in the north to be able to build new transmission infrastructure.
Pipeline infrastructure challenges too.
We probably will, because the
We were comparing notes earlier about, so not to steal your time,
you won't steal my
but
thunder, Pete, don't
New
worry.
England, the power mix in New England is about 50% natural gas currently. But in peak periods, in the dead of winter or in the hottest periods of summer, that's closer to maybe 18%. And that's all driven by a mismatch in terms of infrastructure. They don't, the power generators in New England are not encouraged to purchase capacity on a pipeline on a long-term basis, and so they haven't invested. And when we've tried to advance incremental upgrades to get more natural gas to New England, we've run into some of the same problems that Gary and Hydro.
Yeah, Pete and I realized that we maybe have more in common than we thought that we did originally. So to kind of speak to that, there are some very aggressive public policies in place in New England and notably Massachusetts, although it's not the only state with this type of policy, to bring more clean energy onto the grid and to really move towards an emission-free grid for their state. But this is a region that has 6 states under one, what we call the independent systems operator, which is really what regulates the flow of energy. So it's a rather complicated region to work in from that perspective. We'll see where that goes, but I do want to move on to a second one here. This is on the New York side, the Champlain Hudson Power Express, which is a similar line. Once again, New York has some very aggressive and even more aggressive targets in terms of decarbonization than New England does. New York wants to move to 70% renewable energy by 2030, which is in an electricity perspective, basically tomorrow, by 2040 to an emissions-free grid. And while the northern portion of New York State is actually in a pretty good space as far as that's concerned, they're probably about 85, 90% renewable already. The southern portion, i.e. New York City, Long Island, et cetera, is sitting at 90% fossil fuel use. And they want to move to 100% clean energy in a very, very short space of time. Now, we all know, anybody who's been to New York knows that there's tons of space all over the place where you can put new energy facilities and build wind farms and put lots of solar. So it really shouldn't be a problem, right? Well, apparently they think it is a little bit of a problem. So the New York authorities decided to add a new class under their clean energy standard, which was to say anybody who can build a transmission line into the New York City pocket and bring clean energy will be eligible to receive renewable energy credits. So very recently as actually last week, we received the final authorization for this project from New York authorities. So we're clear to move forward with basically our construction on the New York side. This would bring a little more than 10 terawatt hours into New York City, will represent, once it's online in 2025, 20% of the electricity in New York. So it's an exciting proposal for us. It's one that has been a long time coming. I realized I have a 13-year-old daughter. I began working on this project just before I went on parental leave with her. So both have grown up, are considerably different than they used to be. And anybody who's got a 13-year-old, you can imagine what that gives, but it's ready. I think New York is ready for this project now. There's been an upwelling of support for it at a whole lot of different levels. This will bring clean energy into neighborhoods like Queens and the Bronx, which have typically had a whole lot of heavy industry imposed on them. They've got all the fossil fuel plants that currently supply Manhattan, and they have very high asthma rates. So they equivocate clean energy with part of the solution to really improving their air quality in this region. Now, touch wood, we were in the same situation with the main project. We had gotten all of our permits and we were ready to go forward with construction on this project. And right now there's nothing much going on. So I'm hoping that New York will go forward. All the signs seem to be there. But it does raise a question as far as how do we actually get some of this big infrastructure built in North America? And that's for me, that's a big part of the supply chain issue. We do have to move that energy from point A to point B towards its end user. And if we're not able to do that, is anybody else going to be able to do that as well? Maybe one more aspect that I want to touch on. We talk a lot about clean energy replacing other types of energy. But there's a whole lot of other phenomena that are kind of happening in North America right now. We're talking about building tons of offshore wind all down the eastern seaboard. New York is definitely one of the top motors of that. They're looking to bring on 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind. Currently, they have none. It's moving very quickly. We hope that it will move very quickly, but those are all intermittent sources of energy. So they're great when they're working, but when they're not working, you flip the light switch on and it doesn't work. And I don't think anybody's really in a space these days where they're willing to accept that. And that's where we kind of see a future role for our resource. is that as far as we can get these grids integrated and we can get lines up and running, and these lines are bi-directional, we can flow power down south, but we can also pull power back from those markets. So we envision a time in the future when there'll be times when we'll be selling into New York City and supplying their energy needs, but probably their offshore wind, probably in the middle of the night, will be generating too much energy with respect to what they need. We can pull that energy back up, store it in our reservoirs. It's like a huge liquid battery, and then flow it back to them the next day or maybe 5 weeks later. So what we're creating here is an energy system which is vastly different from what we see today and will necessitate a great deal of collaboration between states and provinces and between the two countries if it's really going to get off the ground. So we kind of call that the battery of the Northeast. And leave it there.
Thank you. Just, it is a theme. This is the North American collaboration, and I will probably, if no one asks a question, I will in advance. I think we need to talk about the challenge of project by project analysis of net zero, right? We end up with way too many, for example, environmental activist groups who pick on a project. We end up with too many government policies that will say that project has to be net zero without understanding how capital markets work, for example. So this is a great example of if we want to have clean energy, why on earth are we not actually collaborating and cooperating more where clean energy is sourced and where it's needed? So I do think there's some really interesting opportunities.
And if I may, I think we can go a little bit even further with that reasoning, is that by doing projects on a piecemeal basis, we're not necessarily getting the best deal for the ultimate ratepayer who is paying for all this. So the energy transition is going to cost us something. It's going to cost somebody something. And there's really only two sources of financing for this. One is the ratepayer. You're going to be paying more for your electricity, or it's the taxpayer. You're going to be paying more for your taxes. Now, nobody's really crazy about either one of those two things. We've got other stuff to do with our money. So we have to find a way to be able to plan this in a little more of an efficient way so that we can reduce those costs. And there's been a lot of great work done, notably by MIT most recently, on how we can kind of integrate, they've done work on the Northeast region per se, integrate hydro-direct resource in with New England and New York and keep those costs down. And it's about $4 billion per year once you get up to 2050. So it's not negligible.
Well, and for businesses like ours where it's, we have all the Petro-Canada decisions. So we have direct line to 5 million Petro-Canada points members across Canada. Those are customers. They're not paying because they're ratepayers. They're not paying because it's a utility. And we witness what's happening politically when prices at the pump go up. President Biden and a whole lot of other politicians around the world, in fact, some countries where there's massive civil protests and deaths because of people protesting high energy prices, and correspondingly a lack of sufficient government subsidy, how quickly things change, right? So it's taxpayer, it's utility payments, but it's also customers who see some of these challenges immediately, and it all speaks to being able to look for efficiencies, which we're not finding right now.
One other thought on top of that that's very consistent with what you both said, but even just in the context of what the policy goal is, right? The overarching policy goal, New England's a great, or maybe not a great example, but in terms of a very aggressive approach to greenhouse gas emissions and a very laudable set of goals over time. As a result, so I referenced in peak periods where gas power generation is not able to run because they don't have sufficient access to the feedstock. And Gary reminded us that they don't today have incremental capacity to move more hydro down from Quebec. So in January and February, these peak periods, New England is generating more electricity from fuel oil than any other part of the country. And their renewable opportunities are burning wood and trash. So it doesn't make sense. The same thing's played out in Europe. Burned more coal over the last 20 months because they pulled nuclear off the table, if not invested or diversified, created optionality in terms of global LNG. And so we need to be mindful of how to consider what's in the best interest of ratepayers and also what aligns to the most efficient solution from an environmental perspective as well.
All right, over to you, JB.
Great, thank you, and thanks to Koosley and the group for putting this great event together. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'm from Cleveland Cliffs, which most people that if you know Cleveland Cliffs probably thinks of us as an iron ore company. That is no longer the case, although we still are a major producer of iron ore. It has been transformed into a steel company over the last 2 years. And I remember the date very well. It was March 13th of 2020. About the day the world shut down with COVID is when Cleveland Cliffs took ownership of AK Steel, where I was a longtime employee. And it was the day that the lights went out in most of the automotive assembly plants across the Midwest and North America entirely. So it was a challenging time, and it was a really, I'll say, a gut check moment in the strategy of Cleveland Cliffs to invest in one of its largest customers and then continue on that path in building their steelmaking assets large enough to be the biggest flat roll supplier of steel in North America. And what does that mean to the industry? Well, the steel industry gets a bad rap, in my view, of being a major carbon dioxide emitter, and we are a huge energy consumer. However, we would say we're the solution. We are a steel producer that makes all things that go into electrical transmission in our GOES products. We have solutions for nose traction motors, and we have large plate products that can go into wind towers and some of these other large, small nuclear reactors. So there are lots of things that we would love to be able to invest in and make more of in North America as we make this energy transition. And it is coming, and it is coming fast. So as we look at the vast operations that we have, I didn't list the iron ore mines in Minnesota and Michigan, but you can see where we have various operations, including a small tooling and stamping operation in Canada. So it is not just an American story. This is much to the theme of the conference. It's Canada and the US working together. So looking at some of the markets that we serve, although automotive is really our primary focus in terms of the more demanding products that we make, we have a huge portion of our business that goes into the trade, both for end users. Think of the heating and air conditioning, as well as appliance markets. Whirlpool, one of our largest customers, as an example, but also for small manufacturers. Lennox, if you go to some of the heating and air conditioning units that they're making in North America, we're a critical supplier to them and others. But also for energy. I mentioned the electrical steel products. I've highlighted in green some of those products that go into what would be green energy. So it's advanced high strength steels for lightweighting, key to the automotive industry, being able to take weight out without going to more environmentally impactful products like aluminum or carbon fiber that take 6 or 10 times the amount of energy to produce versus steel. So again, we see ourselves as a major solution there, and we have been and will continue to be a major supplier to the automotive industry for architecture, both on ICE and hybrid and battery electric vehicles. It does not change the fact that steel is still the economical and value choice when it comes to all things ESG and building that architecture for economically built cars. Then you go down the list. Plate products are huge into infrastructure. We just got the support of the US government for a large infrastructure package, which is going to generate lots of construction jobs that, oh, by the way, we need more people to help fill those jobs, fill those projects that are going to be done here in the next 5 to 10 years. That is starting to generate some momentum. The plate products that go into wind towers, there's a huge portion for the onshore wind as well as offshore. You think of the monopile systems, and that's even more steel that goes into the base units for those individual pieces of equipment that help to generate that green energy. And then the obvious ones for the grid. They're a small portion of our production, but we're making electrical steels with our EAF technology in Butler, Pennsylvania, and finishing some of our nose products in Zanesville, Ohio. So those are key critical operations for supplying the products that are needed for this transition, both from the energy generation side as well as the automotive companies that are looking to go to battery electric and hybrid vehicles. So just talking a bit about what is unique about the American and the Canadian steel industry is making this transition as we speak. They've announced significant investments to go to more EAF technology. I would say there's a zero-sum game there. There is a limit on how much scrap exists in the world, and that limit is a bit increasing in some areas and decreasing in others. I'll show you a slide here in a second about the US industry and how scrap is becoming a more precious resource for this very reason, which is more and more countries around the world are looking at scrap as an opportunity to build their industry in a cleaner way. The prevalence of scrap in the US is largely based on the manufacturing base that was built in the early 1900s. So we have generated a lot of end-of-life scrap as a result, as opposed to China, which just started to really build their steel industry up over the last 20 years. So they're just starting, they're just the tip of the iceberg on a lot of those products that they had built in the early 2000s, 2010s are now coming to the end of life. And a lot of building products last for 30 or 40 years in use. So they aren't going to see the end of life for those products for years to come. We have a prevalence of natural gas that allows for cleaner energy versus coal or oil or some of the other older fossil fuels. But natural gas is primarily hydrogen, and it is a much cleaner source of energy than some of those other older fossil fuels. And I just wanted to highlight the challenges that we've had as a manufacturer in the US with the shrinking scrap supply. There's a couple different factors here. We've offshored a lot of our intermediate manufacturing, which has taken the scrap with it. And you've also lost some of the scrap because we've become more efficient in being able to produce higher grades of steel with less scrap as a byproduct of our production. Every ton of steel generates its own byproduct of scrap along the way. We have slitter scrap and caster scrap and all the things that go into the production of that product. But we've become incredibly efficient with longer sequences at the caster, longer runs through the hot mill, longer runs through our coating lines and finishing units, which generates less scrap as a result, which just means that there is less prime scrap available to use for critical sheet products. And then again, this just gets into a little more details without getting too far into the weeds about how much steel goes into generation of green energy. So if you think of wind energy, it's about 130 tons of steel per megawatt for the generation. For solar, our galvanized products make the support systems for the galvanized panels that sit and collect the solar energy. There's about 40 tons per megawatt in that source. And then the GOES grid, if you think of every megawatt of electricity goes from a power source, so it's generated at a certain voltage. You step it up to go to the high voltage power lines that pass that electricity to the substations that then distribute it, and it steps down to your 110 or 220 feeds that go into your house. And those are all going through transformers, and they're relatively simple, but not so simple type devices that there are only a few producers of those very critical pieces of our infrastructure that you need to have in order to get electricity from the power generating source, whether it's hydro or wind or a fossil fuel generating site, to your house. And then just a commitment to our environmental sustainability improvements. Cliffs has been on this path long before it became cool, but just to highlight again, we're working to stretch our hot metal, use less coke in our generation of the liquid iron that we're using in a lot of our integrated processes to make steel. And that just means that we're generating a lot less CO2 per ton of steel that goes out the door. We're not trying to do this by making less steel. We need the volume to help spread those fixed costs that we have. But it's not just about tons, it's about making the right tons for the right applications. And we're doing that through both the innovation process that my product research group is doing every day, looking at not just what we make now, but how do we make better products for the future in all of these markets? And then also, how do we make the products that we're making, the process that we're making those products with every day cleaner? How do we do it with less carbon dioxide generation? So our goal is to get down to 33 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emitted. We're well on that path. 2020 would have been very close to that goal for the wrong reasons. We were making less steel because of some of the impacts of COVID, but we see ourselves very much on that path to be able to get to that goal by 2030. And we'll be setting new goals. We haven't set the aspirational targets yet because we need the electricity generation to be greener. We need the infrastructure to be in place for green hydrogen, for example, that isn't there today to be able to commit to bigger targets that we really need to achieve by 2040 and 2050. Thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
Great, thanks, Toby. So we have 15 minutes left for questions, but I see on the thing that there are some questions, but I don't have a machine in front of me. So is it possible to just get a summary and then obviously, Ambassador, if you have a question, but I just don't want to miss the questions that we have on.
I'll talk about it. The first question is, what is your sense of what is behind Maine's decision regarding Hydro-Quebec? And are there any free trade agreements that cover transmission, or might there be?
Trade specialist in this area, right over
I
there.
was afraid you were going to say that was a question for me. So.
Well, it is.
I guess it is. So maybe I'll start if anybody wants to jump in. So this was a citizen-led referendum, and I debated whether I was really going to bring up the inner workings of this referendum, I would say, because there was a whole lot of different forces that were kind of behind this. There are certain gas generators, and I'd say fossil fuel generators, because not only gas in the region, that stand to lose a great deal of market share and a great deal of profit once Hydro-Quebec arrives. We are a little bit a target in this region as we are in other regions, because contrary to other sources of renewable energy, we perform the same energy service that a fossil fuel generator performs. So we are there with a reliable source of energy and a competitively priced source of energy. We don't have the intermittency that wind or solar does. So it's a threat from a competitive standpoint. And there were three companies that are from outside of Maine, but that supply energy to the Maine to the main consumers, who got together and funneled a lot of money into opposition groups on this, which I find is very unfortunate. I think we have a realization in the energy sector that we are going to be using fossil fuel for a very long time. And you know, what Pete was talking about is that there are a lot of great companies out there that are trying to look at other things and trying to reduce their environmental footprint from their core business. But I think there are others out there that are looking to kind of derail clean energy projects because it does mean a change in their bottom line. So that was the intention behind this referendum. There are constitutionality questions that are linked to this, because we had all of our permits that were given after a 36-month review by the Public Utilities Commission of Maine. So that's after expert testimony. This is a quasi-judicial branch of the government that does have to emit a permit. And now what we're doing is giving a mandate to the legislative branch to overturn that. So there are questions here that really have to be looked at. And there's a secondary issue, which is vested interest. Those permits had been given, the money had been invested, and construction had begun. So you go through a 3-year permitting process to be able to build a project, and then the goalposts are moved. So to what extent does that hold up, and to what extent does that really herald a strong investment future for the state of Maine? Those are questions that honestly that we're asking ourselves these days.
I think both of our countries have really suffered in the last few years from political decisions that have given a flip-flopping impression. And anybody knows anything about the investment community, they need predictability and they need certainty, especially for long-term projects. So we've had our share of them in Canada, and Keystone's another one where there's a legal action in place now because commitments get made and then they get cut. And it doesn't do North America any good
again, as a North American perspective, we suffer from the flip-flopping as a group. Were there any others from the, and Ambassador, do you want to?
I mean, there's a whole host of sizes, and I should have maybe spoken a bit to that. So there's small, your typical on-grid small modular reactor is around 300 or 400 megawatts. But there are what's called very small modular reactors, so BSMRs, and there's micro modular reactors called MMR. So they can go all the way down to 1 megawatt, and probably below that. But typically what I see is sort of your 1, 5, 15, 50, and then 300. It's sort of those sizes, but they can become very small. There's ones that are actually seen as sort of almost a battery that you could put in the back of a truck and drive up somewhere in a remote setting, and locate it there and then take it away when it's done. Yes, yes, yes. Well, I think there's a growing abundance of evidence that it's not physically possible to get to it. So yeah, that's the beauty of these reactors. And yeah, I think there's a lot of work though that we as an industry, or the nuclear industry, needs to do about the public acceptance of nuclear. And most, I think, for new jurisdictions to feel comfortable, or jurisdictions that are not nuclear jurisdictions to feel comfortable with them. And then the other Achilles heel that I'm going to raise, because I almost always get this question and no one's asked it yet, maybe it's because we only have 4 minutes, but it's the nuclear waste paradigm. And the industry, again, we need to do so much better at how we talk about it. We need to stop calling it waste, and we're working on that, because every generation form is going to have waste. Absolutely every generation form. It doesn't matter what you are talking about. And one of the benefits of the byproducts, as we're starting to call it, or the waste in nuclear, is that it's a very small amount. If I had a Coke can, it would contain all the used fuel that would have been generated by nuclear in my entire lifetime if I had used nothing but nuclear energy. So we're not talking about vast quantities. It is fully accounted for, and that all the nuclear generators that produce this waste have to know exactly where it is and have to set aside funds to pay for its long-term disposal. So, and everybody knows exactly where that is. And you can't say that of other wastes. And you can't say that of solar panels and batteries, and where do those products come from? Yeah, there are some nuclear technologies, new SMR technologies, they're called Generation 4, the next ones that can consume this used fuel in their processes. So, maybe we really do, and I'm here, let's go call it waste. I mean, we need to call it used fuel. And it's fuel that still has radioactivity in it that can be used for things. And as an industry, we just need to do better. And we're working on that. We will.
Here in the oil sands in Canada stand to become by far the single largest customer for SMRs potentially in Canada. We need heat, we need thermal power, not electricity. So we are looking at for in situ projects, for example, the 15 to 30 megawatt, but a 15 megawatt provides us the equivalent of 30 in terms of thermal. So there's some really interesting things being developed. The other thing I would say is the safety record. The statistics are the number of people who have died historically from radiation or nuclear is infinitesimal. The number of people who died from Fukushima was, as I understand, one that had nothing to do with the nuclear reactor. It was the evacuation. So, those of us who actually want to reduce emissions globally, we need to be able to have these conversations with real facts, real evidence, and the right language.
We need to share. I mean, I think almost every person that we've invited to come out and tour one of our nuclear facilities and to tour our waste management facilities, we are currently storing the waste. And this includes community members in the region and stakeholders, politicians, and Indigenous communities. And after people have had an opportunity to come through and see the facility and understand how we run our nuclear plants, how we store this waste on an interim basis, I think they appreciate things much differently, and their views can be changed. So we just need to do much better at sharing that information and sharing it in a way that's understandable then also getting feedback from the communities and understanding their perspective. And I'm speaking most particularly about Indigenous communities. We've been spending an awful lot of time lately with Indigenous communities and speaking about nuclear. Because it's, if we cite one at Darlington, if we cite one of these SMRs at Darlington, that will be in the backyard of Indigenous communities. And we need to listen to what their interests are. And they can often, very often, help us to understand some of the issues that are going on with climate change in a way that we can't. And so I think it's really a two-way conversation there. So more work to do.
Who here's been to San Diego?
Big harbor, right? An awful lot of big ships.
Those ships have been using small, in effect, small modular nuclear reactors for decades. So there are some opportunities here for us to actually get our heads around what we need to do from a climate perspective and how we can do it. Any of the others from the crowd or from online? Okay.
Question is, do the panelists think or feel that climate disclosure rules coming from the regulators, including those that might eventually be finalized, will those have an impact on some of the net zero anticipated dates or other related impacts?
We're all jumping to answer that one. It's an interesting question. I think I'll avoid the temptation to get into the details of what's been proposed either in Canada or in the US by securities regulators. But consistent with the question, right, that there is more disclosure in terms of climate risk that's on the horizon. And I think what it will likely do is encourage certain issuers that may not be on the path that the companies represented on this table are in terms of robust disclosure, commitments, targets, and a level of assurance to validate their data. It will force others to get on that path sooner. I guess the reverse is there's, in a net zero context, you push too far, too fast, you may encourage certain issuers to go private. But
I
others
don't
may
think
have a
so. I
perspective.
mean, we're a debt issuer. But I think most organizations in Canada are prepared to be completely and fully transparent on the status of things. And we are certainly at LPG. And someone here, I think you sort of help spearhead, she sits in the board of LPG and helps spearhead our ESG efforts. And I think the more transparent we can be about where we're at with the things that we're doing, particularly around climate change, is expected from our shareholder, it's expected from our communities, it's expected from our employees, our board. I see no significant risk. I don't know, we're a bit of an odd duck.
It's really time consuming. It's like other securities regulations. There's a temptation to be private because it's so cumbersome. But certainly any of the organizations that we and others are there's an embracing of, it's going to be cumbersome, but it's something we need to do.
Yeah, maybe I would add, and it's not directly linked to disclosure, but I think we have to get better at actually determining what our carbon footprint is in various industries. And we've all got methodologies, and those methodologies are modified with time as science evolves, because this is a fairly recent kind of thing that we're looking at. And we took a long time to get our minds around how do we compare an industry like ours that does not have emissions during its operating phase, but does have indirect emissions when reservoirs are created and when plants are built, and compare that to an industry which has regular emissions that we usually call smokestack emissions throughout its entire generating life. And how do you compare those two things? And right now, it's life cycle analysis over a 100-year period. Already, that is a tough thing to get your mind around because we have to factor in so many things into that. And we have to make sure that when we're looking industry to industry, that we're comparing the right things so that we're really getting a good portrait of what's going on before we get to the point of being able to disclose.
Well, it has to do with the vintage of your plants, like when were they built?
Right.
I mean, it's incredibly complicated, and there's not really enough clarity coming on how to do that in a consistent way. But I think most organizations are doing that.
there's a heck of a micro industry that's being set up for exactly this. I think we are at 2:59, so we have 1 minute. That will give me enough time to say Heather Ferguson, Pete Sheffield, Gary Sutherland, JD Chronister. Thank you. Great panel. And as Chrisanne said earlier, please join me in thanking this panel, but also thank yourselves. This is going to be on.
Okay. Thank you very much, Heather, for the energy panel. You guys were outstanding. Very interesting discussion. Much appreciated. Much to think about. Thank you very much. We're going to take a break until 3:15, and we're going to come back and talk about a very interesting and exciting topic about the ESG, environment, social governance challenges in North American supply chain. So back here at 3:15. Thanks.